Marcus sat on the bleachers after practice, staring out at the empty field. The sun had just started to set, casting a golden glow over the grass, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. He could already picture himself playing under the bright lights of the NFL, wearing the jersey of a big team, making tackles, and hearing the roar of thousands of fans. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, grinning to himself. This was it. The culmination of years of hard work, early morning practices, late-night gym sessions, and pushing himself further than anyone thought he could go. From a rough neighborhood and a single-parent home, he had turned every challenge into fuel for his dream. And now, with scouts coming to watch him at the next game, the NFL draft was just a few months away. "You all right, Marcus?" His teammate Devin called from across the field. "You've been staring out there for a while now." Marcus laughed and stood up, grabbing his bag. "Yeah, man, just thinking about what's next." He jogged over to Devin, who gave him a playful shove. "You mean thinking about all the money you're gonna make?" Devin teased. "You'll be out there signing million-dollar contracts while the rest of us are stuck here." Marcus chuckled, but there was truth in Devin's words. This wasn't just about money, it was about providing for his family. His mom had worked 2 jobs for as long as he could remember, and his little brother Jaden had grown up with hand-me-downs and meals that were often stretched too thin. The NFL wasn't just Marcus's dream, it was their way out. It was a future for them too. Later that evening, Marcus headed home, where the smell of his mom's cooking greeted him as soon as he opened the door. Jaden, now 13 and already taller than most kids his age, was hunched over a video game in the living room. "Big game coming up, bro," Jaden said without looking up from his screen. "You ready?" Marcus smiled, ruffling Jaden's hair as he passed by. "Always ready. You coming to watch?" Jaden nodded. "Wouldn't miss it." In the kitchen, his mom was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. She turned when Marcus entered, her eyes tired but full of pride. "How was practice?" "Good," Marcus said, leaning against the counter. "Coach says the scouts will be there for sure." His mom's smile was warm. "I'm so proud of you, Marcus. You've worked so hard for this." Marcus's heart swelled. His mom was his biggest supporter, the one who had pushed him through every tough moment when it felt like the world was stacked against them. He had promised her that he'd make it to the NFL, and that once he did, she wouldn't have to work another day in her life. That night, after dinner, Marcus lay in bed staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed next to him. It was Emily, his girlfriend, texting him goodnight. She'd been with him since high school, through all the ups and downs. She understood how much football meant to him, how much this chance meant. He texted her back, promising he'd call her in the morning. As he drifted off to sleep, his mind kept returning to the same image. The NFL draft, hearing his name called, walking up on that stage. The dream was so close he could almost touch it. But somewhere, deep inside, a small voice whispered that nothing ever came easy, especially for someone like him. Marcus brushed the thought away, focusing on the future, not realizing how quickly things could change. Marcus never imagined how fast life could flip upside down. One minute he was preparing for the biggest game of his college career, and the next, he found himself sitting in a police station, hands cuffed, a mixture of confusion and fear twisting in his gut. It all started after a team party. The guys had gathered to celebrate their latest win, the final boost before the scouts showed up for the next game. Marcus wasn't a big drinker, so he stuck to soda and kept his distance from the rowdier players. He wasn't about to risk anything this close to the draft. Everything had to be perfect. His childhood friend Trey showed up unexpectedly. They hadn't talked much recently. Trey had drifted off after high school, hanging with the wrong crowd, but tonight Trey seemed excited, full of stories and catching up on old times. Marcus felt a twinge of guilt for losing touch, so he stayed longer than he planned, chatting with Trey and a few other friends from the neighborhood. As the night wore on, tension began to rise between some of the players and a group of guys who'd crashed the party. Shouting turned into shoving, and Marcus, trying to avoid the mess, pulled Trey away from the brewing fight. "We should bounce, man. This isn't worth it," Marcus said, but Trey waved him off, his eyes narrowed on one of the guys. "I'm not gonna let them disrespect me like that," Trey muttered, pulling his arm free from Marcus's grip. Before Marcus could stop him, Trey lunged into the crowd. Chaos exploded around him. Punches were thrown, and Marcus backed away, unwilling to get caught up in it. His whole future depended on staying clear of this kind of trouble. He turned and left, assuming Trey would handle it. Hours later, Marcus was woken by loud knocks on his apartment door. 2 police officers stood on the other side, their faces serious. "Marcus Henderson?" one of them asked, already knowing the answer. "Yeah, that's me. What's going on?" "We need you to come with us. You're being arrested for aggravated assault." The words didn't register at first. "What?" "No, there's been a mistake. I didn't—" "Sir, we need you to come with us," the officer repeated, his tone flat. Before Marcus could process it, his wrists were in handcuffs, and he was being led out of his apartment into a squad car. Neighbors peered through their windows, and Marcus felt a knot of humiliation rising in his throat. This couldn't be real. At the station, the reality of the situation hit him hard. The police claimed he had been identified as one of the people involved in a fight that left a man severely injured. Marcus kept repeating that he had nothing to do with it, but the officers barely listened. When they showed him a grainy security photo, his heart sank. The image wasn't clear, but it was close enough. The man in the picture looked like him, same build, same features, but Marcus knew it wasn't him. He hadn't thrown a single punch. He hadn't even stayed long enough to see what happened. But someone had named him, and now he was stuck trying to prove his innocence. As they led him to a holding cell, Marcus's mind raced. Trey had been the one in the middle of the fight, not him. How had his name come up? Did Trey say something? Marcus sat on the cold metal bench in the cell, his future slipping away with each second. The dream of the NFL, his entire career, was suddenly hanging by a thread. Marcus sat in the courtroom, his hands trembling under the weight of the handcuffs. The judge had just read the charges: aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and intent to cause bodily harm. Words that didn't belong to him. Words that now seemed to define his future. His attorney, a public defender assigned to his case, whispered assurances that didn't match the bleak reality. Marcus glanced over his shoulder at his mom sitting in the back, her eyes red from days of crying. Next to her was Emily, staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and determination. But even with all their support, Marcus felt completely alone. The prosecution painted him as a violent athlete who let his temper get the best of him. They claimed witnesses had seen him throw punches, that he'd been involved in an altercation that left a man in the hospital. Marcus wanted to scream out to tell them they had it all wrong, but no one was listening. The trial moved quickly. The evidence, thin but damning, piled up. The grainy photo, the witness statements, none of it showed the truth. Marcus had been there, sure, but he hadn't done anything. He had tried to stop Trey, tried to leave before things got out of hand. But in the chaos, someone had singled him out, and now his life was unraveling. Trey hadn't shown up, not to the trial, not to offer support, not even to explain what really happened. It was like he had disappeared, leaving Marcus to take the fall for something he hadn't done. In a matter of weeks, Marcus was convicted. The sentence was harsh, years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He'd never felt so helpless, his future torn away in an instant. His NFL dreams? Gone. He wasn't going to walk across that stage, wasn't going to hear his name called in the draft. Everything he'd worked for since he was a kid had been destroyed in the blink of an eye. When the sentence was handed down, his mom let out a sob. Marcus could barely look at her. He knew she had believed in him more than anyone, and now he was letting her down in the worst way possible. Emily had rushed to his side after the hearing, her hands grabbing his through the cold metal bars of the holding cell. "We'll fix this. We'll find a way," she whispered, her voice trembling but full of determination. But Marcus didn't feel hope anymore. He only felt the crushing weight of failure. A few weeks later, Marcus was transferred to a state prison, and the harsh reality of his new life settled in. His days became a blur of monotony, waking up to the sound of cell doors clanging open, standing in line for meals, and trying to keep his head down among the other inmates. The life he knew, the life filled with football, dreams, and hope, was a distant memory now. At night, Marcus would lie awake, staring at the ceiling of his cell, replaying everything in his head. If only he hadn't gone to that party. If only he had left earlier. If only he hadn't tried to keep Trey out of trouble. But there was no going back. The damage was done. The headlines were brutal. College football star convicted of assault. His name had become a scandal, a cautionary tale. The NFL scouts stopped calling. The offers dried up. It was like he had vanished from the world he once belonged to, erased by a single, devastating accusation. In prison, Marcus tried to keep up his training, pushing his body to stay in shape, but it wasn't the same. Without a goal to aim for, it felt pointless. The dream he had chased his whole life was over. And in its place, there was nothing but empty days in a prison uniform, waiting for time to pass. Prison was nothing like Marcus had imagined. He'd heard stories about it growing up, but nothing could prepare him for the cold reality of it. The clanging metal doors, the echoing footsteps of guards, and the constant tension in the air. It was a place where every day felt like survival. The first few weeks were the hardest. Marcus kept to himself, head down, not wanting to draw attention. He ate in silence, barely speaking to anyone. The other inmates seemed to sense his unease, watching him with a mix of curiosity and caution. Some knew who he was, that football player, but no one cared about his past accomplishments. Here, he was just another prisoner. Inside his cell, Marcus struggled with the isolation. The walls felt like they were closing in, especially at night when the noise of the prison would die down, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He couldn't stop thinking about everything he'd lost. The NFL, his family, his freedom. The bitterness gnawed at him. Emily had been visiting regularly, but each visit chipped away at him a little more. She sat across from him in the visitor's room, trying to stay positive, her eyes full of determination. She would tell him about the work she was doing, how she was looking into the case, how they were going to find a way to appeal. But Marcus could hardly listen. All he could think about was how unfair it all was, how his entire life had been ripped away for something he didn't do. "I'm still fighting for you, Marcus," she would say, squeezing his hands through the glass barrier. "You're not alone." But Marcus felt alone, completely. His mom was struggling to hold it together too. He could see the pain in her face every time she visited, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Jaden had stopped coming as much. Marcus didn't blame him. He knew his little brother looked up to him, and now he had nothing left to look up to. His reputation outside the prison walls had been shattered. The media frenzy had died down, but the damage was done. In their eyes, Marcus was guilty, and no one cared enough to listen to his side of the story. Every time he thought about it, the anger bubbled up inside him. He replayed that night over and over in his head, wishing he had done something different, wishing he had just walked away from Trey completely. In the yard, Marcus tried to keep up his routine. He hit the weights when he could, ran laps, and did push-ups in his cell. The physical activity was the only thing that kept him sane. But it was different here. There were no coaches, no teammates, no game to look forward to. He was just going through the motions, trying to hang on to whatever part of himself hadn't been swallowed by this place. Some nights he'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the walls closing in. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of the prison, the clank of gates, the occasional shout from another inmate. It was in those moments, lying alone in the dark, that Marcus felt the full weight of his situation. The NFL draft came and went, and no one called. The opportunities he had once worked so hard for had disappeared, leaving nothing but emptiness in their place. Slowly, Marcus started to push people away. Emily, his mom, his friends, they kept reaching out, but he didn't have the energy to meet them halfway. Every visit, every phone call felt like a reminder of what he'd lost. The dream was gone, and he couldn't see a way out of the nightmare that had become his life. It was during one of those long, bleak days in the yard that Marcus met Frank. At first glance, Frank didn't look like much. An older man, probably in his late 40s, with gray streaks in his beard and a slight limp when he walked. He kept mostly to himself, just like Marcus. But there was something different about him, a quiet confidence, like he'd seen it all before and wasn't fazed by it anymore. One day, while Marcus was lifting weights, Frank wandered over and started talking to him. "You're that football kid, right?" Frank asked, his voice rough but calm. Marcus nodded, barely looking up. "Yeah, something like that." "You got talent, I hear," Frank said, sitting on a nearby bench. "Too bad you let it go to waste in here." That hit a nerve. Marcus dropped the weights, turning toward him. "I didn't let anything go to waste," he snapped. "It was taken from me. I don't belong here." Frank didn't flinch. He just nodded, as if he'd heard it all before. "None of us think we belong here," he said, his eyes scanning the yard. "But the difference between us and you is you still got a chance. You can still get out of here and do something." Marcus scoffed. "What do you know about it?" Frank leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. "I know more than you think. I used to coach football, high school level. Had a kid once, kind of like you, full of potential, but one mistake, one wrong place, wrong time, and everything went sideways." That caught Marcus's attention. He'd heard plenty of guys talk about their glory days in here, but something about Frank seemed real. He wasn't boasting or trying to prove anything. "What happened to him?" Marcus asked, his voice quieter now. Frank sighed, rubbing his hands together. "He didn't make it, couldn't handle the pressure, couldn't handle losing it all. But you're still here, and you've still got time. If you let this place break you, then it's over. But if you keep yourself in the game, if you fight, there's still a shot." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, the words sinking in. He hadn't thought about it like that before. Up until now, he'd been letting the bitterness consume him, letting the system win. But what if Frank was right? What if there was still a chance to fight back? Over the next few weeks, Marcus found himself gravitating toward Frank more often. Frank had been inside for a long time, locked up on charges of fraud and conspiracy that he swore were bogus. He'd long since given up trying to clear his name, but he hadn't given up on life. Frank's story, though different from Marcus's, had parallels that hit home. "Look," Frank said one day, "you can sit around feeling sorry for yourself, or you can get your head back in the game. You don't control what happened to you, but you sure as hell can control how you respond." That was the wake-up call Marcus needed. With Frank's guidance, Marcus started training harder, but not just physically. Frank pushed him mentally too, helping him focus on what was within his control. They ran drills together, lifting weights, running sprints, and even talking strategy about how Marcus could still make it once he got out. Frank had connections, people who still believed in second chances. More importantly, Frank taught Marcus to believe in himself again. He reminded Marcus that football wasn't just about strength. It was about discipline, endurance, and never letting the other guy know you're down. "You may be in here," Frank said one afternoon as they finished a run, "but your mind, your spirit, they're still out there. Don't let anyone take that from you." For the first time in months, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt since the day of his arrest: hope. While Marcus was finding new strength behind bars, Emily was waging her own battle on the outside. She had never stopped believing in his innocence, and no matter how many doors were slammed in her face, she kept pushing forward. Marcus might have been losing hope, but Emily wasn't ready to give up. As a law student, she didn't have the connections or the experience to take on such a big case. But she had something more powerful: determination. Emily spent hours digging through Marcus's case files, trying to piece together what had really happened that night. The police reports, witness statements, the grainy surveillance footage, none of it made sense to her. Something was off, and she knew it. The more she read, the more she realized that Marcus had been a convenient target. He fit the description of the guy in the fight: big, athletic, and easy to pin the crime on. And because of his profile as a high-profile college athlete, the media was quick to jump on the narrative. But Emily knew Marcus. He wasn't violent, and he had no reason to get involved in something like that. There had to be something more. One night, after hours of combing through old documents, Emily found a small lead: Trey. His name had come up multiple times in the initial investigation, but then it seemed to disappear. He hadn't testified, and his involvement had been quietly brushed under the rug. Why? She started asking around, visiting their old neighborhood, talking to people who knew Trey. It didn't take long for her to realize that Trey had gotten involved in some shady business since high school. He was mixed up with a local gang, and rumors swirled that he'd been involved in several other fights, though nothing had ever stuck. Emily's gut told her that Trey had something to do with the fight that landed Marcus in prison. Maybe he'd been the one throwing punches. Maybe he'd been caught in the middle. But somehow, he'd escaped responsibility, leaving Marcus to take the fall. Armed with this new information, Emily reached out to a lawyer she knew from her internship, David, who had a reputation for taking on tough cases. David wasn't convinced at first. He'd seen too many similar situations where the evidence just didn't add up. But Emily's passion and the strange gaps in the case intrigued him. He agreed to help, and together they started digging deeper. They pulled Trey's criminal record, piecing together a trail of minor offenses that had never gone anywhere. It seemed Trey had been protected, likely by someone within the system, and Marcus had been the perfect scapegoat. As David and Emily worked together, they discovered a string of corrupt practices within the local police force. Evidence tampering, cover-ups, and a history of unfair arrests. It was becoming clearer that Trey hadn't just disappeared from the case. He had been erased, with Marcus set up to take the blame. Emily kept Marcus updated during her visits, though it was hard to get him to believe they were making progress. He'd been burned by the system once already, and he was afraid to hope for anything. Still, there was a part of him, buried deep under all the anger and disappointment, that wanted to believe her. "Look, I know it seems impossible," Emily told him one day, her eyes full of conviction. "But we're getting closer. Trey is the key, Marcus. If we can prove what he's done, we can get you out." Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the visiting room ceiling. "Even if you prove it, Em, what's left for me out there? The draft is over. The teams have moved on." She grabbed his hand through the glass. "We'll figure it out, but first we need to clear your name." For the first time in months, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Emily was right. Emily and David worked tirelessly to build a case. Their investigation led them deeper into the tangled web surrounding Trey. It turned out Trey hadn't just been involved in petty crimes. He was part of a larger criminal operation, with ties to local gangs and corrupt cops. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear that Trey had used Marcus as a shield. Knowing Marcus's high profile would deflect attention away from him. It wasn't easy, but Emily managed to track Trey down. He'd been laying low, avoiding any public attention since the night of the fight. When she confronted him, he was defensive, even hostile, but Emily didn't back down. She pushed for the truth, accusing him of letting Marcus take the fall for something he did. Trey's cocky facade faltered. "Look, I didn't mean for it to go down like that," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "I was just trying to stay out of trouble, all right? The cops needed someone, and Marcus was, well, he was there." "That's not good enough," Emily shot back. "You ruined his life, Trey. He's in prison because of you. You need to make this right." Trey hesitated, clearly torn between self-preservation and the weight of his guilt. Emily pressed harder. "You owe him, Trey. If you don't come forward, we'll make sure everyone knows what you've been up to. It's only a matter of time before the truth comes out." Her threat worked. Trey agreed to talk, but only with the guarantee of legal protection. David worked out a deal, and Trey finally confessed. He had been the one who threw the punches that night, not Marcus. Trey had started the fight, and when things got out of hand, he'd panicked, letting Marcus take the fall. The police, eager to close the case, didn't push for more details once they had Marcus in custody. With Trey's confession in hand, Emily and David filed for a retrial. They gathered more evidence of the police corruption involved in the initial investigation: missing documents, mishandled witness statements, and a clear bias against Marcus as a troublemaker athlete. Slowly, the pieces started to fall into place. It wasn't a smooth process. The district attorney's office fought back, unwilling to admit their mistakes so easily. But the case had gained attention. Local media picked up the story, and suddenly, Marcus's name was back in the headlines, this time framed as a potential victim of a wrongful conviction. In prison, Marcus followed the news with cautious hope. He couldn't quite believe that things were finally turning around. Emily visited him every week, keeping him updated, showing him the progress they were making. But Marcus, hardened by months behind bars, struggled to let himself believe in the possibility of freedom. "Do you think it'll really work this time?" Marcus asked during one of her visits, his voice thick with doubt. "I mean, after everything?" Emily nodded firmly. "I know it will. We've got Trey's confession, and the evidence is on our side now. It's just a matter of time." And she was right. A few months later, Marcus found himself back in court. This time, the atmosphere was different. With Trey's testimony and the evidence Emily and David had gathered, the case against Marcus crumbled. The judge, after reviewing the new evidence, overturned the conviction. When the verdict was announced, Marcus sat frozen in disbelief. He'd spent so long feeling trapped, so long thinking this day would never come. But now, as the reality of his freedom sank in, all he could do was breathe a deep, shaky sigh of relief. He was free. The nightmare was finally over. As he walked out of the courthouse, blinking against the bright sunlight, he saw Emily waiting for him. She ran up to him, throwing her arms around him in a tight hug. "I told you we'd get through this," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Marcus hugged her back, the weight of the past year lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future didn't seem so bleak. Walking out of those prison gates was a surreal experience. Marcus had imagined it so many times, what it would feel like to be free again, to breathe air without bars in front of him, to step into the world he had been cut off from. But now that it was real, he wasn't sure what to do next. The world outside felt overwhelming. Emily was waiting for him, just like she'd been there through the whole ordeal. Her eyes shone with relief, but Marcus could see the concern behind her smile. She knew this wouldn't be easy for him. Freedom didn't erase the months he'd lost or the opportunities that had slipped away. As they drove home in silence, Marcus's mind raced. The NFL draft had come and gone. Teams had picked their players, rosters were filling up, and the calls from scouts had stopped long ago. The draft, the moment he had worked toward his entire life, had passed him by while he was locked up for a crime he didn't commit. When they arrived at his mother's house, the family was waiting. His mom had been through hell while he was gone, but now she had a light back in her eyes. She hugged him so tightly, he thought she'd never let go. Jaden, his little brother, stood off to the side, looking awkward and unsure. Marcus hadn't seen him much since the trial. Jaden had stopped visiting, maybe because it was too painful to see his big brother behind bars, or maybe because the whole situation had changed how he saw Marcus. Marcus walked over and ruffled Jaden's hair. "You good?" he asked, trying to break the tension. Jaden nodded, his eyes downcast. "Yeah, I'm glad you're home." Marcus smiled weakly, but inside he wondered if things would ever really go back to normal. So much had changed, and part of him still felt like he didn't quite belong anymore. That night, as he lay in his old bed staring at the ceiling, Marcus felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. Sure, he was free, but what did freedom even mean now? His football career seemed like a distant dream. He wasn't in shape. He hadn't been on a field in over a year, and the NFL had likely moved on without him. Emily, as always, had faith in him. She sat beside him, gently rubbing his shoulder. "You're not out of the game yet, Marcus. We'll figure this out. You can get back to where you were." He appreciated her optimism, but it felt like too much had been lost. Still, something in her words stirred the old fire in him. Could he really make a comeback after everything that had happened? He wasn't sure, but one thing he knew for certain: he couldn't just give up. The next morning, Marcus did the only thing he knew how to do. He started training. It wasn't easy. His body was stiff, and he felt out of sync. But every day, he pushed himself a little harder. His mom watched him from the porch, a silent encouragement. Frank's words echoed in his mind. "You don't control what happened, but you sure as hell can control how you respond." Slowly, Marcus found his rhythm again. His workouts became more intense. He ran laps through the neighborhood, hit the weights, and even started practicing drills in the park with Jaden, who was thrilled to be playing football with his brother again. The game was still in him. It was like muscle memory, coming back one step at a time. But as much as Marcus was rebuilding physically, mentally, He was still struggling. The prison experience had left scars, and the thought of getting back on a field, facing the public eye again, was daunting. The media still remembered him as the guy who got convicted. Teams weren't calling, and the clock was ticking. Every day that passed was one less day to prove he still had what it took. But Marcus wasn't ready to quit. Not yet. Months passed, and Marcus pushed himself harder than he ever had before. Every morning he woke up before dawn, training relentlessly as if he were preparing for the biggest game of his life. The physical toll was immense, but he knew it wasn't just his body he had to rebuild. It was his spirit. The world had written him off, but Marcus wasn't ready to accept that. Still, the doubt lingered. No NFL team had shown interest in him since his release, and the draft had passed without his name even being whispered. Marcus felt the weight of time slipping away, knowing that the window for an NFL career was small, and for someone like him, someone with a prison record, it was even smaller. But then something changed. It started with a phone call from an old friend. Coach Davis, who had been Marcus's high school coach, reached out to let him know about a regional NFL scouting event. It was a long shot, meant for undrafted players and guys who had slipped through the cracks. But it was a chance, and Marcus wasn't about to let any chance slip away. When he told Emily about it, she smiled, her confidence in him never wavering. "This is it, Marcus. This is what we've been working for." Marcus wasn't so sure. "I don't know, Em. There's going to be hundreds of guys there, most of them younger, in better shape. Guys who didn't lose a year of their life." Emily stepped closer, looking him square in the eyes. "You're Marcus Henderson. You fought harder than anyone to get here, and you've got something those other guys don't. Grit. This is your shot, and you're going to show them exactly who you are." Marcus nodded, trying to absorb her faith in him, but deep down, the fear of failure gnawed at him. The day of the scouting event arrived, and Marcus walked into the stadium feeling like a rookie again. The nerves were electric, buzzing in his veins as he took in the sea of hopeful athletes around him. Some were fresh out of college, others were trying to make a comeback like him, but they all had one thing in common. They were hungry. Marcus stretched, mentally preparing for the drills ahead. As he glanced around, he noticed a few scouts looking in his direction, whispering to each other. He couldn't tell if it was out of curiosity or skepticism, but either way, he knew the whispers weren't in his favor. His past was still hanging over him like a dark cloud, but once the drills started, something shifted in Marcus. It was as if the months of frustration, anger, and hard work all exploded out of him. He sprinted faster than he had in years, his muscles remembering the way they used to move, the way they used to dominate. He hit the tackling dummy with a force that surprised even himself, sending it crashing to the ground. As he moved through the drills, everything fell into place. His body, his mind, everything clicked like it used to, like football was still a part of his very being. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like himself again, like the player he had always been. The final test was a simulated game where the scouts could see players in action. Marcus lined up on defense, his heart pounding. He watched the offense line up, and when the ball snapped, he moved without thinking, instinct taking over. He blitzed the quarterback, cutting through the offensive line with precision and speed, and sacked him cleanly. The play sent a wave of energy through him, and for a moment he forgot about everything. Prison, the past, the doubts. It was just football again. By the end of the day, Marcus was exhausted but proud. He had given everything, and though he didn't know if it was enough, he knew he had left it all on the field. As he packed up his gear, one of the scouts approached him. "Good work out there, Henderson," the man said, glancing at his clipboard. "We'll be in touch." Marcus nodded, his pulse quickening. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. It was hope. The days following the scouting event were some of the longest of Marcus's life. He replayed every moment on the field in his head, wondering if he had done enough to stand out. The weight was agonizing, the uncertainty weighing on him with each passing day. Emily tried to keep him optimistic, but even she could see the toll it was taking. One morning, Marcus's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat as he stared at the screen. Could this be it? With trembling hands, he answered. "Hello? Marcus Henderson?" a voice asked. "Yeah, this is Marcus. This is Coach Reynolds from the Seattle Seahawks. We've been reviewing your performance from the scouting event, and we'd like to invite you to a training camp." For a second, Marcus couldn't speak. Training camp? With the Seahawks? It felt surreal. His mind raced, trying to process the fact that his dream, one he thought was gone forever, was suddenly within reach again. That's incredible, Coach," Marcus finally stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I won't let you down." The call ended, and Marcus sat there, stunned. Emily, who had been watching him anxiously from across the room, rushed over, her eyes wide. "What happened? What did they say?" "They want me to come to training camp," Marcus said slowly, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. Emily let out a joyful laugh, throwing her arms around him. "I knew it! I knew they'd see what I see in you!" But Marcus's excitement was tempered by the reality that this was only the first step. Training camp would be brutal, filled with younger, faster athletes fighting for a spot. He was starting at the bottom again, and he knew he'd have to work harder than ever to prove he belonged there. When Marcus arrived at camp, he felt that familiar mixture of nerves and adrenaline. The competition was fierce, and every day was a grind. The coaches didn't cut him any slack. They pushed him harder than the rest, likely because of the stigma surrounding his past. But Marcus didn't mind. He welcomed the challenge. Every tackle, every sprint, every drill was another chance to prove to himself and to everyone else that he still had what it took. And little by little, Marcus started to stand out. His speed and strength came back to him, sharper with each practice. The other players began to respect him, not just because of his skill, but because of the way he carried himself, the way he refused to give up, no matter how tough things got. By the end of camp, Marcus had earned a spot on the practice squad. It wasn't the starting lineup, but it was more than he could have hoped for. He was back in the game, and that was enough for now. The first time Marcus suited up for a game, standing on the sidelines in his Seahawks jersey, he felt a rush of emotion unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This wasn't just about football anymore. It was about everything he'd fought for, everything he'd survived. The roar of the crowd filled the stadium, but in his mind, all he could hear were the voices of the people who had stood by him through it all. Emily, his mom, Frank. They had never given up on him, and now he wasn't going to let them down. As the season wore on, Marcus's role on the team grew. He went from being on the practice squad to getting snaps in real games. And every time he stepped onto the field, he played like it was his last chance. Because in a way, it was. Marcus wasn't the star player, but he didn't need to be. He had earned his place, and that was enough. His story became one of redemption, of beating the odds and rising from the ashes of a life that had nearly been destroyed. One night after a game, Marcus sat in the locker room, exhausted but content. Emily called, and when he answered, her voice was full of pride. "You did it," she said. "I always knew you would." Marcus smiled, leaning back against the cool metal of his locker. "We did it, Em. We did it." In that moment, Marcus knew that while the NFL had always been his dream, the real victory was the journey that had brought him here, the fight to reclaim his life, his name, and his future. And as long as he had those, he had already won.